In some of your interviews before, you've talked about kind of going from maybe wanting to be an actor because that was in movies to realizing that there was, an author behind movies, and that a filmmaker, then that was what you wanted to be. I mean, was it a complete coup de foudre, or did you just sort of gradually realize, that sort of thing?
Because of sort of being forced to experience expression or thought, really, in an interior way, because of the limitations I had in 1945, contracting asthma, very severe asthma. I was 3 years old, which negated any possibility of playing any sports, running, or spasmodic laughing that kids do, And so humor became very important to me, storytelling, and storytelling from people in the streets, storytelling from family. There was a lot of family. My mother and father, both sides of their family. They're my father, I think, one of 7, my mother, one of 8 children, so there were lots of aunts and uncles and cousins and grandparents that who spoke mainly Sicilian. So lots of stories, and it seems now like a logical progression to be thinking of who I saw on a movie screen or on a television screen, acting out or telling a story, and that seemed to be the actor. And so naturally, I would tend, at the age of 8 or 9, tend to think that that's who made the movies, and that's what I would want to do. The first name that I remember being associated with films that I really responded to was Ford, John Ford, particularly Westerns, and Westerns were at the height at the time. The one that made the biggest impact was these films that I saw made by a very strange-sounding name to me, Elia Kazan, and they seemed to really reflect the world I knew, or people I knew. We see Marlon Brando and Viva Zapata, but it was nothing compared to On the Waterfront. But it had more impact because Viva Zapata was still a period piece dealing with Mexico and politics and that sort of thing. On the Waterfront was as if they'd put a camera down where I was living. Kazan was a name I saw associated with something that just leapt off the screen and just took possession of me, so to speak. East of Eden was the other one. Not very long after, by the way, the shock of seeing Citizen Kane on television.
You first saw it on television?
On $1 Million Movie. It was shown twice a night, and it was edited with commercials, and the March of Time sequence was edited out. But we didn't know. I am looking at it, I thought it was amazing.
Yeah.
And I knew Orson Welles as an actor, having seen him in some other films. The big revelation there was going up to the Thalia Theater, uptown New York, and seeing Citizen Kane on the big screen for the first time. Or even The Third Man, which I saw on television, having missed it in the theater when I was young. I remember my father was going to take me because the music was very important, a Third Man theme, and it was played on the radio all the time, and I couldn't wait to see it. Then I remember getting sick or something, and I couldn't go, and I missed it. But I saw it on television, and Carol Reed, Graham Greene, Orson Welles, all those things pulled together right around that same time. This is all buoyed up, so to speak, from having been exposed to Italian neorealism at a very young age, and the names I knew there were De Sica and Rossellini. In the late 40s, my father had gotten a television set, I think in 1948 or 49. And at that time, we were living on Corona, Queens. But we had to move back to Elizabeth Street in 1950, which was kind of a shock, coming off the Bowery and Skid Row, and it was like suddenly being thrown into the middle of the Dead End Kids. And I wasn't allowed to run or play or fight or any of that stuff. In Corona, they had on a Friday night, I remember, there were showings of Italian neorealism, Italian films, they put it this way, for the Italian-American community. And at that time, there was only 2, I think, stations in New York coming out of New York. There was no transcontinental hookup of any kind. So I think 2 or 3 stations. And this was a local station, and they showed Bicycle Thieves and Shoe Shine, and of course, Open City. And the one that made the biggest impression on me was Bicycle Thieves and Paisan. I mean, obviously, my grandparents were the same people in the movie. They were speaking the same way. And this was something going on in another place, but the emotion and the power was universal. And I felt it as a child. I knew it. somehow the near-realist pictures were movies, but I'm not saying they were truer, but they hit me on another level that I can't really describe.
Take my mother, for instance. The only psychology type advice she ever gave me, she said, Murray, eat first. I mean, what kind of psychology? Who? So what, you know? But Joe, I mean, no, sir, not him.
Something in me made me begin to understand that that could be converted into other styles, or maybe if you tap into the truth of that, maybe you could make films that can maybe touch upon the impact that you felt and you saw have in your family in the kitchen there in 1949.
Did you feel that all of this cinema was on a continuum? Did you perceive the Italian films as being somehow more artistic, or
No, not more artistic. There was a continuum. They're in the same playing field. If you're talking about La Strada, or you're talking about Rome, 11 o'clock, or whatever, films like that, or Bitter Rice, no, these were not necessarily deemed more artistic. They were maybe more powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow, there was another sensibility that was different from the Hollywood film. And that's not denigrating the Hollywood film, it's just another aspect of it, and yet it was the same medium. The only way I could start to express how I felt about this stuff, I started drawing pictures, and the pictures became like cartoon strips that I saw in newspapers, but ultimately they became storyboards. The storyboards were a 1:3:3 aspect ratio. I enjoyed it very much when CinemaScope was introduced, and I would do wide frame.
Your storyboards changed
Oh, yeah,
accordingly?
absolutely, absolutely. Even 3D, without 3D, of course, putting little pasting little hands coming out of the paper, and that sort of thing. But primarily, when I would show to my friends, I wouldn't show this to many people, but maybe a couple of friends of mine, and I would say that now the camera, and then I would say that from this frame, we moved here, and they say, Marty, these are just still pictures. I said, no, they're moving. They're moving here and in here.
Yeah.
And now the camera comes around this way. Apparently, I've seen it happen in these movies. They start from there and they go there, and then this happens and that happens. Why can't we do that in the pictures? In between the lines, the camera's moving, or there are cuts, you see. And so I stumbled upon it that way out of desperation. I also didn't know much about lighting or utilizing a camera. We didn't have enough money to have a 8mm camera. I still don't know much about lighting because I didn't grow up that way. I grew up more in the tenements. It was night, and then it was day. That's it. It was more about hallways and windows and looking out over the city. Sometimes you go up on the roof. That was wonderful. The roofs were wonderful because you could see the city,
Did you incorporate those different vantage points into your storyboards?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Here I'm looking down from the roof.
Looking down all the time from primarily from the third floor front. It's in 253 Elizabeth Street is still there. And I would see everything go on through that fire escape from that point of view. And I do like overhead shots that way, or slightly overhead, But the panorama of life, good and the bad, all happening right down there, like a giant fresco of some kind. But it does come from trying to make sense of where the hell I was and how I would fit in. And the neighborhood was the formative time for me, there's no doubt. That Lower East Side, Skid Row was tough. Then the derelicts died sick in the street. And
you would see
suffering
that as a child.
constantly.
Yeah.
We became friends with some, especially if they were sober. Then they would do a little bit of work. They'd tell us stories, things about World War II. They came from, a lot of them were vets. We met people that, it's extraordinary. People just went there to die, And then you have the working class community trying to raise their children in a protected way, but it's very hard. And you have the underworld element, which just was a fact. You couldn't tell what it was at first when you were a kid, but ultimately you began to learn, listen, and be careful. It was like, that just was what it was. It was an old-fashioned way of it, in terms of that, the old-fashioned organized crime groups, let's say. I don't even know what the crime family names were. I have no idea. I mean, I do. A number of people have told me, but I've forgotten them. That goes to show you to the extent of which I was told not to say anything. There are names I know I can't say. I don't remember them. Every time I try to say them, there's a block.
Would you hear stories about, or were they sort of
We
whispered?
hear stories.
Or?
No, well, whispered, yeah, but primarily it was in the kitchen and the tenement. My father, eventually when he began to understand, when I was able to understand certain things, he'd say certain situations, and I would hear him talking to my uncles, his younger brother, who lived downstairs, who was a sort of a ne'er-do-well and was always in and out of jail, kind of ultimately became almost like a template for Johnny Boy and the wilder characters in my movies, Kichijiro even, in Endo's Silence. This was regular life. This was daily life. There was always the talk of who was in favor and who was out. Sometimes people would just not be there anymore, whether ostracized or taken out. We don't know. I mean, or I was told, I don't remember really these things. It was a very real part of life. And it was a part of life where, as in on the waterfront, certain people were locked under, in a way, and didn't have the wherewithal because of their families and because they had to earn a living, didn't have a wherewithal, and didn't have the education, didn't have the ability, didn't have the connections to break away from this oppression, basically, and had to live within it. I had to live under it, and that's all there is to it.
When he was 21 years old, he decided that he wanted to get married, and he went to my mother, and he married her. And he got married right here in the old St. Patrick's Church.
Around the corner was St. Patrick's Old Cathedral, first Catholic cathedral in New York. And that gave me a stability in my life. I was sent to the grammar school, the elementary school there on the corner of Mott and Prince Street. It's now a condo.
Is it before or after Vatican II?
Before.
So it was still
All
Latin.
in Latin.
Yeah.
All in Latin, which I had to learn. And a lot of the older priests were there for the old Sicilian and Neapolitan community, spoke mainly Italian, but they would, in these sermons, were pretty interesting.
Even to you as a child, the sermons were interesting.
Yeah, because it was about what's right and what's wrong. There was a young Italian-American priest who was his first parish, Father Francis Principe, and he was about in his early 20s, and he made a big difference. He was assigned to the parish, to the diocese, the diocesan priest assigned to the parish, and he took us under his wing, and he gave us a very strong moral sense, and had no qualms about, telling us when we were wrong, or when we were thinking in a way that we not necessarily shouldn't be, but where it could be steered another way, informing those minds. And a lot of it had to do with literature. He gave us Graham Greene, Dwight MacDonald. I picked up James Baldwin, finally, because it was the beginning of the civil rights action and beginning to understand about human rights. Then I picked up James Joyce, and I had problems reading because of in my family, there was no reading culture. So the books were brought into the house, but it was hard for me to get through them, but I tried, got everything. Primarily, it was cinema. It was movies, that way.
Were you reading about cinema?
No, there was no such thing.
No.
When I did try to do papers at NYU or Washington Square College in the early 60s, the only thing I could get in Orson Welles at the New York Public Library was clippings about his theater work, which was interesting, which was gone, and The War of the Worlds, radio broadcast, and some things on Citizen Kane, basically, but not much. You couldn't find really much about, hardly anything written about film. There were the British critics, Paul Rotha and Roger Manville, people like that, but that was from a distinctly British point of view. Yet, they were intriguing because many of the films we were talking about no longer exist. I'm talking about incredible detail and going into a minutiae of the silent era. Those films are mainly gone.
Yeah.
But in any event, it did skew things another way until we kind of stumbled all the way across, and by the early 60s, the French critics picked up and made us understand a little more about American cinema.
So at some point, perhaps in your teens, you started thinking that this is what you would become, a filmmaker. Like after years of hearing the neighborhood stories and doing your storyboards and cinephilia.
Things that happened that I saw were very compelling. And all of that was feeding into my knowledge and my excitement about the moving image. right around the same time, I think I was 17 or 18, I wound up at Washington Square College. And there was no School of the Arts at the time, and they had one department called Motion Pictures, Television, and Radio, MTR. And that's when I met Haig Manouchian, Armenian American, and he was the head of the film department. And he had an enthusiasm and a passion for cinema that just reflected what I felt. And I was discovering it as I went along. I would just go up to the Thalia Theater and see this Russian thing called Alexander Nevsky, walk in the middle, you know, and suddenly it's Eisenstein. I go see the Dybbuk, the Polish Yiddish films, Edgar Giolma's The Green Light, you know, and you're suddenly seeing this whole other culture and these worlds through cinema. Television had it too, where they would show foreign films once a week on Channel 9. I saw Pate Panchali on Channel 9. I saw my first Japanese film, Ugetsu, Mizoguchi's film, dubbed in English, by the way.
Dubbed, it was not subtitled.
No,
yeah.
no. Some were subtitled. La Belle La Bête was subtitled. Subtitles I found fascinating because you could see how they're really speaking, and that's what they sort of mean, in a way. But you got the body language going on, you know. And especially because growing up with another language, Italian, sometimes I may not understand specifically what they're saying, but I could tell what they're saying. By the time 60 or 61 came around, you're talking of the period of new American cinema. Jonas Mekas, Stan Brakhage, Shirley Clark, so many great people. Movies that weren't necessarily what we would know as conventional narrative, but they were narrative of another kind, maybe of emotion, of thought, you know, like moving paintings. So the key here ultimately was when I saw John Cassavetes' Shadows. And that's when I realized that a film could be made. You could do it yourself, so to speak. So the only thing you could do with this new equipment, lightweight equipment, coming in from France, the Eclair camera and that sort of thing, was to eschew, so to speak, the style of the Hollywood film and just try to find your own. Doesn't mean that grainy 16mm black and white is more truthful. It just was the only way to do it. And taking the lead there, as far as what you have to say, if you had anything to say at all at that time, you could find that as a form of expression. It's possible. It's very possible. And then when we saw Shadows, absolutely possible. I mean, Shadows, I prefer Faces, I prefer his later films, but Shadows was the one that just opened the way. And then Shirley Clark did The Cool World. She did The Connection first, which was rarefied for me, but The Cool World is the one that also locked in, and she did that in 35mm, black and white. That gave us the impetus to think that you could actually make a movie. Not only think it, believe it. You know it. Not that you believe it, you know it. You just know it. You go and you say, you know you're a director, quote unquote, whatever that means. And people look at me and say, no, pick up that rock, you're a PA. But I'm a director. But all right, pick up the rock.
You're at NYU and you've seen Shadows. You're starting to think, you know, okay, I have no more. It's time for me to get started. Did you start out right away wanting to make movies in a particular way, in a particular style, or were you?
I think so.
Like,
I think so. There was no doubt. At first, I was fascinated by the technical side in terms of making a film. But in terms of what I wanted to express, later came to fruition with an attempt at Who's That Knocking at my door, an attempt at that. It wasn't very successful, but finally came to fruition in Mean Streets. But all that was being formulated at the time. But I thought at first, my enjoyment of the versatility of the medium itself, the perforations in the frame, what Norman McLaren would do in Canada, and what Godard would do, and what Truffaut would do, with the surprising use of technique and the breaking up technique, and then ultimately, really, I mean, Warhol did this, but that was a separate kind of situation where you'd shoot something for 8 hours in one take.
Empire, yeah.
Yeah, okay, that's Empire. But the point is that it made you rethink the vocabulary of what movies could be. It doesn't have to go from A to B to C to D. It doesn't have to go from 1 to 2 to 3. It can start out at 3, wind up at 6, come back to 1. You could do anything in telling a story.
Here's something, I want you to see this. Look over here. Here's some pictures of Joe when he was a kid. When he was about 6 or 5. He always used to, and right here, it's a picture of him playing football. That's right, that game, that was his favorite. That's him there with the ball in his hand. And that's his graduation shot with the hat. I could go on all day with these things. It's not important.
That's what's sort of interesting about it. It's not just you, Murray, because, you know, you can
Yeah.
see like a lot of different techniques and styles and things being brought to bear on what's still kind of a recognizable story about your,
Yes,
you know,
yes, it was a
neighborhood.
recognizable story about people I knew.
Yeah.
And also recognizable in the sense it was sort of based on, I was fascinated by the gangster film genre. It was something that was revered where I came from. And Public Enemy was the key film, really. It was the one that made the biggest impression I saw as a kid, and its re-release in 1952, I think. The one that incorporated everything, show business, prohibition, everything, was the Roaring Twenties, Raoul Walsh. So Murray comes out of that, mixed with Fellini, mixed with Truffaut, mixed with all these things. I think part of it was almost like just an adolescent's fun enjoyment of utilizing technique.
It's such a playful movie.
Playful,
It's-
yeah, in a way. And even What's a Nice Girl is the same way, but even there, more so about technique.
You know, Harry, I don't want to be nosy or anything, but man, she was a real good catch.
So I married her. Nothing was too good for us. We even had our honeymoon at the New York World's Fair. Unfortunately, it was still under construction.
Because What's a Nice Girl Like You won these prizes at these festivals, Brown University and that sort of thing, and it was able to pay some of the tuition and take the burden off my father and mother, who were working in the garment district. And so they were all excited by this. And first of all, they thought when I said I was going to make movies, I heard them late at night in the other room. I heard my mother say, "I think he's crazy. I think there's something wrong with him." Yeah, I mean, she's probably right, but the point was that the adolescent joy of, watch this, now I'm going to turn this upside down, and this frame, I'm going to print, I used to draw pictures on 8mm frames. You could do anything. It was the enjoyment of learning technique. And as one professor, a very famous professor down there, looked at me one night, he liked the film a lot, but told me, he said, all right, but what you need now is a philosophy. I didn't know what he meant. I was too young. And I think by the time we did Mean Streets, I think it locked in. That these were, in a sense, regarded as enjoyment, fun, but facile. Not easy, not facile is the wrong word, superficial. Murray, I thought more so, had more to it. It's not just you, Murray. It certainly had more to it. It deals with the first film dealing with, again, trust and betrayal.
Joe and me. Friendship, love, life, family. We work hand in hand. Yes, family. I tell you, to my family, to my kids, you know, my children, Joe is like a second father. And when it comes to my wife,
I mean, I've seen it talked about as maybe, you know, a bit of a precursor to Mean Streets, in that there's this central
Very much
relationship.
so, yeah. But it also had elements of Bob Hope and Bing Crosby on the road to Zanzibar, or road to Singapore, where one is always being taken advantage of by the other. Yet there's still the trust, and then a mistrust, and then trust again.
Yeah.
And so you see that in Mean Streets when Harvey goes in the back room with De Niro, Harvey Keitel, and De Niro talks him out of having to pay the debt by explaining what happened, how he lost the money. It's right out of the Road movies, by way of Howard Hawks, by way of Cassavetes, who saw that final version and said, don't cut a frame of that scene. He was right. We had been cutting it up, and it was a mess. You know, it was a very different world to go to from where I grew up, which was like a little village, in a way. I went to Houston Street on Elizabeth, made a left, and went 6 blocks west, and it was a new world. It was Greenwich Village, NYU. Greenwich Village was our campus. And it was like I was on another planet. And I was certainly out of place, completely out of place. But I was in place here. I knew it.
At the same time, when you were going to NYU, you know, so you're like in film class and you're learning about, you know, dolly shots and things like that, but it was also a super exciting time to be a cinephile, yes? I mean, I think like in one interview I read with you, you said it felt like there was an exciting movie coming out almost every day.
Well, that was the point. Pretty much when Claude Chabrol's Le Beau Serge opened and kind of announced, in a way, the coming of the French New Wave. That was followed by The 400 Blows, by Breathless, and then it was full-blown. So that almost every week there was a masterpiece, you know, including Rene films, you know, Hiroshima Mon Amour, and then last year Marienbad, which broke all the rules, let alone the Italian cinema. Fellini, The Spectacle of La Dolce Vita, which was topped 3 years later by 8.5. 8.5 is about creativity. It's about trying to find that spark of, it was called a transcendent spark, of being able to create something, and him falling short of it, ultimately, and then finally coming to terms with himself by the end of the picture. I didn't know that at the time, but I sensed he was out to find something that it was always imminent. It was within his grasp, and it would always go. He would always miss it. He'd miss it. And by the end, he just accepted. Maybe that's the way it has to be, and maybe it will come again. And I saw that, I think, about a couple of weeks before I shot What's a Nice Girl Like You at NYU, which was done in a summer workshop. It was 6 weeks. Script, although I came with a ready script, pre-production, shooting, editing, and finally printing the film in the lab, and then they would screen it at a little event that they gave. So the Italian cinema had a lot to do with it. Bertolucci's Before the Revolution, Bellocchio's Fists in the Pocket, I Pugni in Tasca, Olmi's films, I Fidanzati, Il Posto. Yeah, there was so much. The Russian cinema, Polish films of Andrzej Wajda, very important. Skolimowski, early Polanski films. All of this was hitting us at once. And in fact, we became, let alone Bergman. Every 2 months he had another masterpiece, you know. It was getting annoying. Brian De Palma would say, another one, damn it. And so this was an incredible time. And then late 60s, Hollywood changed for a while, anyway, with Dennis Hopper and Peter Bogdanovich to a certain extent, and Billy Friedkin and Coppola, finally. And then by 72, when I was out there, changed again for a few years. But in any event, all that fed into this time, that fed into there's a, how should I put it? You could not make a movie. You were going to do it one way or the other. Even if they took the camera away, you were going to find a way. So this was a real special time. And then to add to all of that, because Bergman, Fellini, great films, Godard, there was a kind of snobbery about American cinema.
That's what I was sort of asking about earlier.
Yes,
like
yes,
for you, it was always on a
snobbery.
continuum.
Yeah, there are very few films I remember of the 60s, mid to late 60s, and coming out of Hollywood, that meant anything to my generation. Bonnie and Clyde, basically, was the key that changed everything. And so everybody just sneered at American cinema until Andrew Sarris brought over the auteur theory from the French critics. And we went too far that way, but it made us understand that in the codification of the films that came out of the Hollywood studios, there was some wonderful art that was created. Yeah. And, you know, then there's the issue of, because if it's popular, it's not art, or it's not good art. I don't know. I don't know about that. You know, Hitchcock was so popular, it was like a franchise, right? Every year there was a Hitchcock film. That one year this thing, Vertigo, came out, nobody went to see it. It wasn't like the usual, it wasn't North by Northwest, for God's sakes.
No.
That was enjoyable. Vertigo was kind of moody. Okay?
Yeah.
Bad, not dismissed reviews. Nobody kind of liked it.
I mean, he was a brand name, though. I mean,
He was a
people,
brand.
like, you know, like my parents would tell me about, you know, you'd go to see a Hitchcock like you'd go to see a John Wayne movie or something.
Well,
It
even
was,
more
you know,
than that,
like,
it was almost like it was taken for granted. It was taken for granted. And because it was popular, it was not considered art. And if it was art, it was mediocre.
Yeah.
But they made us see it a different way. The French critics made us see it a different way, and the English critics really made us see things a different way. And I was glad that they embraced Ford and Hawks and Hitchcock. That for me, because there was something in me as a young student too, because I did love the Italian films and I did love the French films and the Russian films. And I did feel a little funny about liking the Westerns and liking the musicals and liking some of the Jerry Lewis stuff, and, you know, there was a tendency to be beaten down by your professors in some cases. I remember liking so much The Third Man, but Haig Manoogian When I wrote it as a term paper for him in the first semester I was there, he sent back a B+. He said, remember, this is only a thriller.
Was The Big Shave one of the first movies you made out of NYU?
Yes, yeah, The Big Shave was a film that after NYU, done Nice Girl, I'd done Murray, tried Who's That Knocking at My Door, didn't succeed. Right at that time, I was trying to get films made any which way we could. Anything. Myself and my friend Martin, who just sadly passed away. And Martin is credited on Mean Streets, he's credited on Raging Bull, he's credited on a lot of pictures. And he was Armenian, born in Baghdad from Iraq. And we had wonderful times together. And Martin and I would write anything for anybody, trying to get a picture made. And so there was this kind of a competition at the Palais des Beaux-Arts in Brussels under Jacques Ledoux, who's great archivist and cineast, a European. And it was a competition for, I think, 1,000 feet of Agfacolor film with processing. If you come up with an idea and you write it out, they like it, you'd get it. And so I came up with this idea of The Big Shave. Anti-Vietnam War demonstrations it was a tough time. It was a crazy time. And I was just between that and the civil rights movements and my own personal life, everything was changing. And so it was a very difficult time. It was the decade of assassinations. It was the decade of almost like a national suicide in a way. And I thought of that. And I had this idea about the shaving. Maybe it's Buñuel, I don't know. I saw a number of that, really, even if it was Buñuel, the film I saw, the Chien Andalou, the copies were so bad, you couldn't tell what the images were. So it wasn't that, something else happened, I don't know what it was. And I had this idea, and I thought it was really strong. And I wrote it up, and to my surprise, I got the 1,000 feet of Agfacolor, first color film. And I shot it at NYU. A couple of friends of mine at NYU helped, and certainly helped editing and shooting it. And I sent it to Knokke-Lezoek, was the festival for experimental film. And Amos Vogel was there. And Amos, who had started Cinema 16 with Jonas Mekas and all that New York Film Festival, so I got to know him a little bit. But he was there, and he called me and said the reaction was outrageous. He said he never saw a reaction like that in an audience. Booing and hissing, laughing, throwing things. People were really upset. People loved it. People hated it. He said, I've never seen a reaction like that. And Amos has seen most, he even did a book called Film as a Subversive Art, which I'm glad to say Big Shave is in there. But in any event, I couldn't go there, and it received La Prix de l'Âge d'Or, named after Buñuel and Dali film. That year was Michael Snow's Wavelength won for the Best Picture. This is a very, very serious avant-garde filmmaking group. I just got the money to make the film, and in '68, somehow I was in Europe. A friend of mine was doing commercials there, and he said, come over, and it was first time there, and I wound up at the Oberhausen Film Festival in Germany, short films, and it was shown there, and Amos was there too. And the reaction was, as he said, and he kept telling me, no, he said, and he said at Knokke-Lezoek was worse. You missed the best one. I said, it was worse than that? He said, yes, this was terrible. He said, I know. But the humor of the whole thing, when a person tend to take yourself self-serious, you're so self-serious, and then you got this great idea, and they were all laughing at it. It came off as a kind of crazy black comedy. And I just horror. But I mean, horror induces nervous laughter. I didn't know that. And I said, okay, don't say anything. Just accept that they reacted to it. And so it's a special film that the others are like juvenilia in a way. You're trying. This is something to talk about a philosophy of another kind, maybe. Not directly in the storytelling, but a sense of a national or cultural suicide.
Now my meatballs are in. I shall put my cover on and forget about it.
When I see Italian American, I have a very emotional reaction to that film. I find it so intensely lovable. It's the,
Well, they were lovable. What can I say?
Yes, really.
They really were.
You know, I mean, it's so marvelous to see your mother in the kitchen, like making her sauce almost like through muscle memory. You
Oh, yeah,
know,
yeah,
and,
that
like,
just goes, yeah.
So, yeah. Did you have a job persuading them to do that?
Well, by that time, once the short films won some scholarship awards and things like that, and once I was at Woodstock, for example, I was part of that film. Films were being made all around. There were other people making independent films. They began to really accept it. And also, they were drafted into acting in my student films, because that's your mother and your father. You had, you needed somebody in the frame. Come over here, Mom. Do this for me. How long is this going to take? Because I have to get back. Never mind. So, in a way, it was like a family project.
Then I go here. This is what my mother-in-law taught me. Take a few spoonfuls of tomato and throw them in here because your meatballs remain very soft.
I believe it was a Saturday and a Sunday, and it was only 3 hours each day, and it was 1976, part of this National Endowment of the Arts, something called Storm of Strangers, a half-hour show on all the different immigrant groups that came to America, Jewish, Chinese, Italian, et cetera, Spanish. Mine, I wanted longer, but it was eventually cut down to a half hour, but what you have here is the full version, and the full version was shown at the New York Film Festival. In any event, I decided if they want me to give an impression of the Italian-American experience, because of Mean Streets, I wouldn't do it in a traditional or conventional documentary fashion. So why don't we just go to my mother's and father's apartment and have dinner? And we'll just ask them questions about their lives and what it was like when they were born here on Elizabeth Street, still living on Elizabeth Street. Martin and I came up with this list of questions and things like that. But the moment we put the camera in the room, it's right there, you see it. And Lee Osborne was our sound guy, hit the sync, pan the camera over, they started.
Okay, was that the light?
Where are you sitting? Down there? Why? Why is he down there?
He can do what he wants. Let him do what he wants.
Why are you so far from me?
Okay. All right,
Get
so
closer.
And when they started, I realized that there was no way that I could, not that no way you could control it. You could ask the questions, you could guide it, but what was really happening was something else entirely. And this was much more valuable, I thought, because it'd be like everybody having dinner together.
Were these stories you had heard before? Was any of it
No.
new to you? No,
A lot of it was new to me. A lot of
Yeah.
it was new, yeah. There was a couple of stories that I knew, but and guided towards them. But many things were added. And many things I didn't quite understand about how many people there were in the 3 rooms when they were growing up, what a Christmas meant to them. It was more of an Anglo festival, not Italian, or not, I should say, not necessarily Mediterranean that way, for where they came from. In Cimina, to a certain extent, in Polizzi, Generosa, maybe, these 2 towns that are still there. And Cimina's a beautiful town in the valley. Visconti shot The Leopard there. And Polizzi, Generosa, I believe, Giuseppe Tornatore comes from there. But in any event, it's a Norman castle that's there. It's the ruins of the Normans came down into that area. I didn't understand fully the difference in my generation to theirs. We just didn't. It has to do a lot with a sense of incredible storytelling that they have, but also a sense of love that was there. And as if suddenly the cameras disappeared. And this is where everything took place anyway, at the dinner table in our growing up. There was no dining room. There was a kitchen, dinner table, and next right there was a bedroom, and over there was like a seating area. So a lot of people have that now too. So it's not anything new. It's just that it was very integral to my life. Everything that goes on around the table, and so we just reproduced that, and leading to me deciding to make documentaries because I felt I learned a lot from them about the way she told stories and the way my father behaved, and it took him a while to loosen up a bit. You could see it, and that was interesting. And when my mother was able to tell the story, just holding on the frame.
And I remember him going to Springfield, New Jersey.
At times, we thought, well, in the editing, we'll probably be cutting away to things. But I said, no, don't cut away. I mean, let's just stay with her. Stay with him.
She's such a natural.
She's natural. Let's stay away. So hence, that was probably the most important lesson I learned from the way they spoke and the way they held that frame, all the way up through something in Taxi Driver to a certain extent, and certainly in Raging Bull, and not in the fight scenes, of course, the other scenes, and then up into Silence and Irishman, Italian-American. Became like a companion piece to Mean Streets. Mean Streets is a darker side, there's no doubt. And then that led to, in Taxi Driver, for example, the counterpart to that was The American Boy. But that had to do with a world that I was getting into in terms of almost like stand-up. I was spending a lot of time with stand-up comedians, and they would go all night, usually, in New York or LA, and I wanted to capture some of that, and whatever it meant, the best and the worst of it. And it was almost like capturing a moment in time, which I think a lot of people could say, oh, I have friends like that, or we do that, we did stayed up all night, we told stories, there were drugs, or there was this, there was alcohol, or whatever. And imagine, you know, if you were there, it was so funny, and then you tell the people the story and it wasn't funny. This could be funny. This is funny, but it's also a horror film in a way. So it's funny. Storytelling, and it gets darker and darker and darker. I find that documentaries, or if you call them nonfiction, first of all, they're films. I don't call them, you know, nonfiction, fiction. They're all films. In fact, with documentaries, I find it much more sometimes emotionally compelling. Maybe that has to do with the impression the Italian neorealist films had on me when I was 5 years old. It seemed real, but I knew it was a movie, but it was real. That's it. And so the documentaries are always being made by me as kind of companions to the features. It really is how to tell a story in a different way. Again, different form, which in the case of Bob Dylan, No Direction Home, but particularly in the case of George Harrison, Living in the Material World, and ultimately the Rolling Thunder, Conjuring the Rolling Thunder Review. These documentaries, and the ones on Fran Lebowitz, public speaking, and the ones we're doing now, they all found their way into, I'd say, Departed, Wolf of Wall Street, Silence to a certain extent, and ultimately Irishman. There was a breaking of form, and particularly Rolling Thunder Review, where I don't know what it is, quite honestly. You know, it's a film, a document, it's a film, I don't know. It's a conjure. It's an act of conjuration, you know. And so, in a way, it's how to create something that's mysterious and is not locked into sanctioned forms, so to speak, the expected, and to force yourself to think differently. And that's why I keep making them, or try to. Is that enough?
Thank you so much for this.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.